All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We're just going to give it a couple minutes and make sure that everybody can get in. So you can just hang on for 2 more minutes, then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, it looks like we have most people in the call, so thank you all so much for joining us for our Understanding Housing Assistance class. Just a couple of housekeeping details. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so as our presenters are going through today, please feel free to put some questions in that chat, and then at the end we will bring on all 4 panelists to answer those questions. You can also use the chat function as well if that's easier. We do have 4 incredible panelists with us today to share their insight. So first off, we're going to have Mike Newman, who is the housing specialist with Rocky Mountain Human Services. Then after that, we will have Cassandra Hainsworth, who's the leasing manager with Greshio Housing. And then also to answer questions, we have Sarah Callender, who's the housing coordinator with the Independence Center. And then we have Lynn Symington, who is the rental assistance program manager with the Colorado Housing Division. So I am going to turn it over to Mike, who can go ahead and get us started with the class.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to y'all. Like she said, April said before, I'm the housing specialist with the Homes for All Veterans program here through Rocky Mountain Human Services in Colorado Springs. I'm relatively new to my position, so I'm glad that Sarah and Cassandra and Lynn are here because they can answer a lot more questions than I probably can. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and I have a quick slideshow, and we'll go ahead and get started with that. All right. I hope you can all see that right there. All right, so today what we're talking about starting out is just really understanding housing choice voucher programs. Many of you guys are probably familiar with Section 8, housing choice voucher programs are kind of the new Section 8 or how they frame it, the new wording for it. So what we're gonna look at today is what are housing choice vouchers? How do vouchers work? A couple myth busting and frequently asked questions for vouchers, and then changes to state law related to voucher subsidies that will take effect in Colorado January 1st. We realize that there's a lot of questions potentially about this change. We're hoping today that we can answer many of those questions, but it sounds to me like talking to some experts as we prep for this meeting yesterday, there's still a lot of things to be answered about that process. So please be patient with us as we get to that part, okay? All right, so what I'll do is I'm gonna go ahead and start on a quick video here. Give me just a second. I have to stop sharing this and reshare my screen and pull up a video. This is a quick introductory video on housing choice vouchers that I found that I thought was pretty cool.
This is Renee. Renee is a veteran who is disabled in the line of duty. Her injuries aren't too severe, so she is able to work a part-time job. Over here are James and his twins. James works 40 hours a week at minimum wage. Lana had to quit her job after she started having a serious heart problem. None of these families can reasonably afford a market-rate apartment, not even James. Actually, there's almost nowhere in the US where someone working full-time at minimum wage can pay for a 1-bedroom apartment without spending more than 30% of their income. So right now, James is paying 60% of his income in rent, and somehow he has to use the rest to pay bills, buy food, and raise his kids. What happens to Renee, James, and Lana? Do they get evicted and lose their jobs? Try to live with friends or relatives? Stay in shelters or motels during the night? Maybe. But maybe they can get a Section 8 housing choice voucher, which will help cover the cost of rent. Let's focus on James. James learns about housing vouchers and looks to see if he makes too much money to be able to apply. His income is very low, so he's eligible. James submits an application to his local or state public housing authority, but the demand for housing assistance is always very high, and there aren't any vouchers left for James and his kids. He gets put on a waiting list. The wait is most often 2 years. So 2 years later, James gets a call that a housing voucher is available for him. James can use his voucher to live in any kind of housing as long as it meets health and safety standards, and the landlord agrees to accept the housing choice voucher each month. The voucher is worth a certain amount of money, and James has to pay the difference. Every month, James pays 30% of his income in rent, and the voucher covers the rest. After a year, James decides to move to a city where he can get a better job. He can move anywhere in the US that has a Section 8 program, and his housing voucher will go with him, as long as he works out the details with his current public housing authority before moving. In most cases, James will have to live in an area for a year before moving again. Sometimes, though, housing choice vouchers are attached to specific housing units, and these are called project-based vouchers. If James applied for and received a project-based voucher, when he moves away, he will lose it. The next eligible family on the waiting list moves into that housing and gets the voucher. Those are the basics of the Section 8 housing voucher program. For all of the details and regulations, visit HUD.gov. Practitioners may also find the Public Housing Agency's toolkit useful at csh.org/PHA toolkit.
All right, so let me go ahead and reshare my screen. So thanks for the patience there with the right slideshow. There we go. All right, so I just thought that was a kind of a cool video to kind of give an overview and kind of an introduction to housing choice vouchers. We're going to go a little more into details now about some of the things. What are housing choice vouchers? So a couple things. Housing choice vouchers program is really two programs authorized under the Section 8 of the U.S. Housing Act of 1937, which is amended housing choice voucher program, and as the video kind of mentioned, project-based rental assistance programs. Those are programs that are connected to a specific building or unit. Housing choice vouchers, again, are portable subsidies that can be taken with a family. They can take with and choose their own unit, and basically an individual or family typically pays 30% of their income towards rent, and I think some of the utilities as well. And then the program or the housing voucher will cover the remainder of the rent to the landlord. Here in Colorado Springs locally, housing choice vouchers are managed through public housing authorities such as the Colorado Springs Housing Authority and then the Division of Housing. So thankfully we have some representatives here today to help us with some of those questions about that. Some of the examples of vouchers that you may see managed locally, you may be familiar with, again, is things like Shelter Plus Care Housing Choice Voucher. Another one is called the Family Unification Program, or FUP. Homeless Solutions Program is a state voucher. Mental health is another state voucher. There's another one called Veterans Shelter Plus Care voucher. And then one is known as the HUD VASH, which is a collaboration between HUD and Office of Veterans Affairs. And that comes with a clinical level case management for the participants in addition to the reimbursement that the voucher offers. All right, so this is a simplified version of how vouchers work. Later in part 2, Cassandra will go into a little bit more detail about how they work, but I kind of want to go over this as an introduction. So as the video mentions, a client applies and qualifies for a voucher through their public housing authority. That's either Colorado Springs Housing Authority or the Department of Housing, and I think also in collaboration with the Independent Center. And so again, Sarah Callender can talk a little more about that during the question and answer about how that works. Clients accept vouchers and looks for a rental unit that accepts vouchers, and they get to choose that house on their own. Client finds a willing landlord and enters into agreement, and we'll talk more about details about what that actually looks like, because there is specific paperwork that we'll talk about for that. The client pays a portion of their income, usually about 30% of adjusted income, towards their rent, and then the housing authority will pay the remainder of rent to the landlord. All right, some myth busting and benefit facts for housing choice vouchers. So one myth that we commonly hear is landlords can't charge housing choice voucher participants the same rent as their non-housing choice tenants. In reality, landlords can charge the full amount of rent no matter who the tenant is. The housing authority must determine that the proposed rent is reasonable and is not higher than units in the area with similar amenities. Later, towards the end of our thing, we have some forms that talk about rent reasonableness and fair market rent values. And those are based on, as many of you probably know, based on zip codes. So we have an updated form that talks about what those are currently, okay? Another myth is that housing choice voucher tenants are problem tenants. The reality is, according to statistics, actually housing choice tenants are typically long-term tenants living in a unit for 7 to 8 years on average. There's really no documented statistics, according to HUD, showing that housing choice voucher participants are any more likely to damage units and not pay rent than their non-housing choice tenants. Landlords use their own screening criteria and should screen housing choice tenants as they would screen any other tenants to avoid problem tenants. Another one is that it's almost impossible to evict a housing choice tenant when they violate the lease. The reality is that housing choice tenants are bound by the terms of the rental agreements and are subject to evictions, as is any non-housing choice voucher tenant. Lastly, if you accept one housing choice program tenant, then all of your units must be rented to housing choice program tenants. Renting units to housing choice tenants in reality does not in itself further obligate you to rent to other housing choice voucher tenants. For each vacancy, you should follow your established policies for screening prospective tenants. All right, so frequently asked questions. Again, this came from HUD right here, their website. What forms are required? We're going to go into more detail into these forms later, but again, this is kind of an introduction, so you can see this. There's a RTA, or what's called sometimes it's going to refer to a RAFTA, request for tenant approval. That's one of the initial forms, must be completed to start the process. As I said, these forms will be covered in part 2. How long does it take to schedule an inspection? Times vary by public housing authority, but an inspection is part of that process, as many of you probably are aware of. And that's, again, like it has to be scheduled, but it varies with the public housing authority. Who will issue my payments and who do I contact? Payments are issued directly from the public housing authorities. Contacts are listed below. We have a contact list, and we'll have a slide at the end of the presentation for the contacts with different agencies. So you'll have some of that information as well. And when will I receive payments is another question. Checks are issued after the lease and inspections are completed. Payments are typically paid on the first of the month with some variability amongst different programs. And lastly, is an individual or family allowed to move in before the landlord receives payment from the public housing authority? Landlords are encouraged to sign the lease for the date of the unit is first available and would be compensated retroactively back to the date of the start of the lease. Residents can move in once the lease is signed and they have paid their rent portion if applicable. All right, some benefits just to talk about for landlords. You know, I'm doing my research. I found some, you know, interesting videos and things like that from real estate investment people on YouTube and things like that. And they're, you know, they have videos out there that are trying to convince people that follow them that every one of their properties should be a Section 8 approved unit, and it's obviously a matter of opinion, but one of the big things that many of them say is that you get timely and dependable payments from the public housing authority, and it's pretty much kind of guaranteed monies once everything is set up for the landlord. You get your full rental payments. You receive regular inspections. Those, I believe, occur annually. That's one benefit that some people like about having, is that they catch things before they become major problems. So you do have an inspection that goes along with it. You may request annual reasonable rent increases. There's a process to do that, and that is part of it. So you can request rent increases. That's also kind of a common misconception. You have the opportunity to help low-income, elderly, disabled, and veteran households, as well as families with children, by providing affordable housing. As we know, in this community and in many communities around the country, affordable housing for people with low income or disabilities and families is extremely and increasingly hard to find. So housing choice vouchers have been able to lower the rate of homelessness across our country. One more thing, the average cost to replace a resident is about $2,500. Residents with subsidies and vouchers are in need of a home, not just a place to live. And by renting to the right residents with a voucher, unit turnover can be reduced. Lastly, I want to talk about just briefly changes to Colorado state law connected to housing choice vouchers. There's a lot of conversation about this, and I think we're going to do the best we can, like I said, to answer those questions in our Q&A. But House Bill 20-1332 is prohibit housing discrimination via source of income. That was signed into law by Governor Polis this year on January 14th. Bill summary is quoted here in the text. The ad acts discrimination based on source of income as a type of unfair housing practice. Source of income is defined to include any source of money paid directly, indirectly, or on behalf of persons, including income from any lawful profession or from any government or private assistance grant or loan program. So that this has obviously probably raised a lot of questions, and hopefully we can do the best we can to answer some of those questions for participants when we get to that section. I know there's a lot to that with that. So, and that's really, I have some references if you want to do some more information searching for yourself. There's references on this last page, but that's really I have for my part. So again, thank you very much for letting me present, and I'm going to turn it over to Cassandra now.
Hello. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see here. Okay, so what we're going to review today is the forms that are required once you accept someone, they're approved on your end. Then you're going to send off what we call the RTA or the RAFTA between the Housing Authority or the Department of Housing. Same forms, they require pretty much the exact same thing. There could be a couple of differences. And as we go through the different forms, I'll kind of let you know what each one may look at a little bit differently. So the biggest question a lot of people ask is, well, how much paperwork does this require? So it's really minimal. Again, the first thing you fill out is what we call a request for tenancy approval, also known as an RTA or RAFTA, and that gives basic information about the unit. You're filling in information of, when you want to start that lease, the square footage, when was it built, the unit they're going into, and then you also provide information about the utilities to show who's responsible for what. That part helps whether it's the Housing Authority or the Department of Housing know who do we need to pay or what assistance do they need to provide to the resident to be able to pay utilities. Once you send that in, and then also a copy of the lease, and it doesn't have to be signed, they review it, they evaluate everything. If everything follows under their standards, from there they'll say, yes, everything looks good. Then from there, they schedule the inspection. They usually are about a week out, kind of like what Mike was saying, and they'll correspond with you to go through that. And then from there, once that passes, then you're able to move in that resident. And then after that, we do a HAP contract and execute the lease with the resident. And so we're going to go through all those different forms. So right now, the three major agencies I say we work with is the Colorado Springs Housing Authority. They primarily work with the Housing Choice Voucher, the Independent Center. So they work with the Department of Housing, and they issue also the HCV, the VASH, the Supportive Housing Voucher. So they do those different vouchers as well. Then of course we have the Department of Housing, who also not only do they hand out the vouchers, but they also handle or manage a lot of them as well, just like the Independent Center does. A lot of these are also known as the Section 8 program or a voucher program. So this may look familiar to a lot of you guys. So this is what we call the request for tenancy approval. This is the form where it's very, very important. I can't stress how important it is to have this filled out very correctly with all the information when you're sending this off to the PHA. And then we're going to go through now on how to complete that. So the first part of it is you're going to put whoever the public housing agency is, whether it's the Colorado Springs Housing Authority, the Independent Center, or the Department of Housing. There's a couple other agencies here. We personally work with like Homeward Pike Speak. There's The Place. So again, whatever agency you're working with is where you're going to input that information on there. On the second part is where you're going to put the address. So the complete address for the unit, including the zip code, because again, as Mike stated, we're looking at to make sure the unit they're placed in on that zip code falls under that payment standards. One big key to know is that between the Housing Authority and the Department of Housing, there's actually 2 different payment standards they each go off of. Some of the pricing can be similar, but again, they're a little different. So always look at what PHA you are going off of. The third part is, when are you looking to sign the lease? That way they know on their contract end when that lease needs to start. Then you're going to enter the number of bedrooms, again, because we want to make sure not only on the zip code, but how many bedrooms you have to make sure, again, it falls under that payment standard. And then you want to put the year constructed, that has to be completed. Number 6, you want to put what that rent is going to be, what you're proposing to rent. Same with the security deposit. The resident is responsible for the security deposit. However, there are different vouchers where the state will pay for that voucher. The resident usually knows, and or if they have a housing navigator, they're aware as well if the state will pay that security deposit. So you always want to make sure you input that as well. Then the earliest date the unit will be ready for inspection. You want to be pretty certain on this, because biggest thing with inspections, you don't want to fail an inspection, because all that does is it postpones that resident moving in. So you want to make sure everything's ready for them to go in and inspect that unit. Typically what can happen is usually the same day of an inspection, we try to get that moving at the same day. I can tell you between the Department of Housing and Independence Center, and even with the Springs Housing Authority, they like to execute the lease the same day of the inspection. Number 9, you're going to specify the type of unit being rented. So there's different options depending on what the apartment complex is. So is it semi-detached, which will include townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, and quads. And it can be a garden walk-up, which includes apartment units that are 3 stories or less. So you'll just want to document which one you're renting to. And then on the bottom part, if you receive any other subsidy or have a special financing arrangement for this property, this is where you want to specify that part right here. It includes tax credit developments or any special loans for the development of affordable housing. So that is where you will check mark those right here. The bottom of that page is where you're going to talk about who is responsible for what utilities. Again, this is a very, very important part. I've seen in the past, just talking to other property managers, if you do not fill this out correctly, it can hurt the resident. An example is if you put that they're not responsible for electricity and the owner is, however, they really are, then the state doesn't send them, a check to help pay for that, then their utilities can get shut off. They can be in jeopardy of eviction. So it's very, very important to make sure you're documenting this information for them to know, because it also comes out on that contract as well. So here's where you're going to put the fuel type. It relates to how each utility is powered. So is the stove a gas or is it electric for cooking? Is the unit heated by a boiler system? And how is the boiler powered? And so that's where you'll document that here. This column here, this is where you're going to put who it's paid for. Biggest thing is you want to make sure you're using the T&O. You don't want to do a check mark. You don't want to write in, owner or resident, slash owner, anything different. You always want to use that T&O and stick with that process all the way down. And then you want to make sure who actually pays it. So there's a lot of different options. I can tell you internally with Ratio, it differs with us. We have properties that are flat rate. We have properties that the resident pays or everything's included in rent. So you really want to make sure how it's paid, who's really responsible for paying that bill. Again, because you want to make sure that resident is able to receive additional funding to make sure they pay for that. On other electric here, this refers to additional electricity. So your lights, TV, stereo, different appliances. So make sure you're documenting again who's responsible for anything additional. An AC unit for air conditioning. If there isn't a unit in there, if yes, who's paying for it? Who's it provided by? Again, this is where you want to make sure you're documenting tier O, or if the answer is NA, then you put NA. On the bottom two, regarding a refrigerator, range, or microwave, this is where you put, are they tenant provided? So here's where you'll put who provided. It's going to differ from where it says paid by, because you're just wanting to know who provides that. On to the next part of it. So this is going to be page 2 of the RAFTA. Right here is where Mike kind of talked about where we're looking at comparison of rentals. So you're going to look at the same zip code. So for example, we're not wanting someone to say, oh, well, they got a housing choice voucher. Well, I'm going to charge them $1,000, but everyone else that lives with us will charge them about $700. So we want to do a comparison to make sure that they're treated equally, and it's the same comparison of rent for anybody else. And so that's where you'll enter the unit information, the date it was rented, and what that rental amount is. Here's where you're going to specify the owner's information. So you, as the property management company, will complete this part. And then here's where the household will complete their part as well. Biggest thing, read through everything, make sure you're filling everything out completely. Again, it can be a small little thing to where it won't get accepted. And again, it delays that move-in process. Additional forms with the RAFTA. You're going to have a lead-based paint form that needs to be completed, and that's both for Housing Authority and Department of Housing. Landlord obligations, and you're always going to have to submit a W-9. Sometimes a lot of people will say, oh, I submitted it last year. Oh, I just submitted it with the last, resident. It needs to be submitted for every person that you submit a RAFTA to. So it can be repeated, but they are required, they require this information to make sure, they're following their systems as well. So just make sure when you submit that RAFTA, every additional form is included with that. Same thing with the EFT form. And this is mainly for new landlords. So once you get that set up electronically, you want to submit that form as well. Right now, during COVID, I can tell you with the inspection form, so Colorado Springs Housing Authority, they're actually still entering units, and they are still going in and doing inspections prior to move-in. However, with DOH, they are not right now. So there is a separate form that they will send out once the RAFTA is approved, and they will have you complete that with the resident saying, okay, they saw the unit, they made sure everything follows under the HQS. So when it does come time, everything's lifted and they do go in and inspect, at that time, you're saying, okay, I acknowledge that. Yes, the unit will pass inspection and I agree to the following. So again, like I said, once that is approved, that's when they schedule that appointment to schedule the housing inspection. Here is just a couple different standards that they look at. If you've ever went through an inspection, it's pretty common. So you want to make sure, of course, light fixtures are working, outlets are working, there's no leaks under any sinks or, coming out of any faucets, refrigerator, if you supply microwaves, any of that equipment, you want to make sure everything that's working. No hanging wires, making sure everything's covered, no trip hazards. So those are just a few things to make sure that you really have your unit completed. One, prior to the inspection with like Housing Authority, or when you're completing that form for DOH. And again, a failed inspection will postpone that move-in. So you really want to make sure you meet the HQS standards. So once all that's finalized, they'll let you know once the inspection passes. And from there, then you're able to execute that lease. Meet with the resident, sign the lease, and you always want to make sure once that lease is completed, you want to send that back to the PHA. That way, one, payments can get started. And from there, they're going to send you what we call a HAP contract, the Housing Assistant Payment Contract. That's going to break down section one, the section it shows with the property information, what the rent is, the utilities, and the initial lease term. So you want to make sure that always matches up with the lease that you send as well. Part B, that's the body of the contract. So it states the contract's purpose and the owner's compliance issues regarding items such as the maintenance, utilities, payment of the HAP, as well as general terms and agreements between the landlord and Department of Housing. Part C, that part's called the tenancy addendum, and it's included in HUD's provisions for lease agreements between the resident and the landlord. The tenancy addendum is incorporated into the HAP contract, but you must also incorporate into and attach to all copies of the landlord's lease. So I think they range about 12 to 15 pages when you get an official HAP contract. I can tell you with Independent Center, they will send out that HAP contract and they will have you complete it. It's going to look very familiar to the RAFTA. And again, you're just re-verifying, you know, the rent, the utilities and all that information. With the Colorado Springs Housing Authority, they will execute that contract with DocuSign. So they'll send you the contract, you sign for it, and then you're able to print everything from there. And again, the lease, you want to make sure the lease dates match up, the rent amounts match up. That way you can show whose portion, and always look to make sure the utilities are checked marked correctly. Again, because this can impact that resident. So the basic process, you know, for the lease up process is what the resident's responsible for. So they're the ones that are going to go out, they're going to look for, you know, housing. They're going to make sure it qualifies, meets their standards. They're going to fill out a move-in packet and get all that information. And then from there, the landlord, we're just making sure we're following our obligations. We're giving them a safe place. We're, you know, completing the RAFTA. We're taking the rent, you know, based on their portion, and we're working with that resident. And then the housing authority, they're reviewing the RAFTAs, they're issuing the vouchers, you know, any renewals, any recontracts, they're working on all that part. So in end, we're a big partnership. So you have the participant, the owner, manager, and PHA. So together, again, we're helping in homelessness. We're trying to get people, you know, back in. Let's utilize these vouchers and let's do it as a partnership. So next comes renewals. So you can always have a choice whether you want to renew someone, don't want to renew, increase rent, different things when it comes to renewals. So if you do want to request a rental increase, you have to provide that at least 60 days written notice to the housing provider as well as the resident. They will send out forms, whether it's DOH or in Colorado Springs Housing Authority. They will send out a form asking you, do you know, what's the proposed new rent? Do you plan on renewing? And then you answer questions for them as well. That way they know what that new rent will be. You want to really make sure you do it within that 60 days, because again, if not, you may not get that rent increase. So these are just examples of what the renewal questionnaires will look like. Housing authorities is here. So they send that out. I get all mine via email from them. So they'll send out the renewal questionnaire. They'll have the resident's information, when the lease is ending, and then they'll ask all the information. Again, who's paying utilities, what's the rent going to be, and all that pertinent information. Same with the Independent Center. What utilities are included? Do you plan on renewing? What's the proposed rent going to be? So sometimes it gets to where, you know, we may not want to renew, or we may have demands or different issues like that. And from there, there are steps you can do. So yes, you can evict a problem tenant. It's just the same as any other resident. So you want to make sure you follow the same process for them as anyone else. Biggest thing is you always want to notify the PHA of what's going on, because sometimes they can assist you. They're there to help. Some, you know, I can tell you personally, we've utilized them, like, hey, we can't get in contact, whether it's a renewal or missing information. They're there to help you get that information as well. The biggest thing is you cannot evict a family though for non-payment of the housing assistance. So if there's an issue, reach out to the PHA, ask them, hey, notice we haven't received payment. Is there a change? What's going on? They will always update you. So just know you can only evict if it's the resident's portion, not the housing provider's portion. Another big thing is when you are issuing any type of demands legally, you want to make sure on that 10-day demand, or for non-payment right now, 30-day, that it has the certificate of service. And you're going to have additional steps when it has anything with any type of voucher that you have to do. If you submit it to court without having this certificate of service, the judge will release it if they are a voucher holder, and it will get dismissed at court. So you really want to make sure the bottom of your demands look a little different, and it has the 3 additional steps to do. So for non-renewing, so for example, like I said, if you don't want to renew, you do have that choice to non-renew. Both of the forms do ask that question. Are you non-renewing? It also will ask, if you're non-renewing, did you issue any demands? Did you make them aware of it? That's why it's always helpful to let the PHA know ahead of time as they start getting demands, so they're aware of what the situation can be. So yes, you do have that option of non-renewing. Another thing you can do, now this doesn't apply with the Colorado Springs Housing Authority, however, it does with the DOH. It is called an agreement for mutual rescission. And what this means is, say it's not working, between both parties. However, you don't want them to risk losing their voucher. You just have to agree that, hey, this property is not good for you, as a property, as a resident, let's just go ahead and part ways. So what you can do from there is fill out an agreement for a mutual rescission. And that just pretty much states that, hey, we're going to end the lease. I agree as a resident. I agree as the landlord. And you can send that off to the PHA. And then that pretty much ends the lease and breaks the lease. I personally, with Gretchen, I can tell you, we like using that because in my eyes, it may not work with the program, for us. However, I don't want that resident to lose their voucher. I want them to be able to move on because Gretchen may not be the best fit for them. So sometimes we'll do a mutual rescission saying, hey, we're just gonna, end the lease early and part ways. So this is an option you can do. With the housing authority, they don't have an exact form. However, they are in agreement as well. I can just notify them, hey, they gave their notice, here's what's going on. And it's pretty much just open communication with the PHA of what is going on. So here's some point of contacts regarding who the PHA is, if you guys have any questions on different forms, anything like that. So Mike, who spoke earlier, he is with Rocky Mountain Human Services, Homes for All Veterans, and here's his information. Nadine, who could not be with us today, she is the Section 8 supervisor at the Housing Authority. She's another great resource if you have any questions regarding any vouchers. With the Independent Center, so their housing, they go by last name. So depending on the resident's last name, these will be your contacts here. And then we have Lynn with us, and she's with the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, and she is the Rental Assistance Program Manager. So again, any questions on vouchers or anything, you can reach out to her as well. Bash is another common one that works really close with RMHS. Victoria Scafuto, she is the homeless supervisor. And I can tell you with the VA as well, they're also looking to place a lot. They issue a lot of vouchers as well. And of course, any other questions you guys have, always feel free to reach out to me as well. And is there any questions?
Thank you, Cassie. If you want to stop sharing your screen, then I will bring on everyone else here. Maybe. No, come on. Eventually here. Oh, okay. Sorry, just 1 second. Mike, if you can turn on your video, then I can bring you up as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So we did get a question in the chat. So first of all, just thank you all so much for sharing that information. So one question that we have is, who gives us the forms? Is it the prospective tenant? And
I think I can answer that. This is, oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, it's a prospective tenant. I believe that was asked about the request for tenancy approval. And so a voucher holder, when they are moving, they will be given a packet, whether that's from Sarah or the Colorado Springs Housing Authority, and that will include the RAFTA. So they will bring that into you. And then they will also be able to let you know who their contact person is and who that needs to be sent back to.
Thanks, Lynn.
Perfect. And then I didn't see any other questions in the chat. If any of the attendees have a question and they would like to be able to speak, because sometimes that's easier, feel free to raise your hand and I can let you talk, or feel free to put questions in the chat. Lynn or Sarah, if you have anything that you'd like to add while we're waiting for questions, please feel free.
I'd like to add in, first of all, thank you, Cassandra. That was a great slideshow. The only thing I kind of wanted to touch on was the TRQ, the tenant question to renewal. We do send those out. We try to send those out at least 60 days ahead of time. But if you don't get one from the Independent Center, either you can call us and ask us for one, or you can put in your own writing how you're notifying the tenant that their rent will be going up 60 days in advance. So don't always rely on the TRQ. I have noticed that some of them will go to your corporate office in Denver. And so the actual complex doesn't get it sent to you. So just because you don't get a TRQ, please reach out to us or just let the tenant know. And then let the Independent Center know as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. So we did get a question. Can you share more about the new law taking effect January 2021? Whoever wants to tackle that one, feel free.
I mean, I could share a little bit. I mean, I think Denver has had this law for a while now, and it's now effective, January 1st is going statewide. And so I think just a reassurance for landlords, I think Mike had mentioned, and yes, thanks Mike and Cassandra for the great presentation. Landlords are still can do their screening. So the screening you have for your apartment, you can still say, you know, I'm doing a background check and I'm doing a credit check, and here's the reason why I'm denying an applicant. In the past, you could just, source of income was a reason. And so if someone, apartment complexes might have said, you have to make X amount of money to rent this unit. You have to make 3 times what our rent is in order to rent this unit. Now what this law is saying is you have to take into account that they have a voucher that is supplementing that. So a lot of voucher holders do have low income. They may be on Social Security income and only getting $800 a month. And they're requesting to rent a unit that's $1,100. So prior to this, they wouldn't qualify for that unit because they're not earning 3 times the amount of that rent for that unit. And so an apartment complex could deny that participant or that applicant. So now what this law is saying is you have to, that can't be your sole reason for denying someone, is to say you don't make enough money. If that person on SSI didn't have a voucher and that was their only income, you can still deny that applicant saying, there's no way you can afford this unit because you only have this, you know, you only earn this much money, but you now have to look at if they have a voucher before you can deny that. So hopefully that, sorry, answered your question. I don't know if I could.
No, that was great. Thank you. And I know, and you just kind of talked about this, Lynn. I don't know if you guys can expand. I know that qualifying a prospective resident for their income is a little bit different depending on the voucher. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about that?
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. I don't know how Colorado Springs Housing Authority, I'm assuming it's probably very similar to the Division of Housing and Sarah and even Mike, is that every year the area median incomes are published. And so with HUD vouchers, they state that a certain percentage of anyone on your program when they initially come on must be at or below the very low income of AMI. So they want 75% of anyone who comes onto housing assistance programs to be at or below 30% of AMI. So that is just at initial application. And the goal is, because we are trying to serve, with the Division of Housing, we're trying to serve the hardest to serve, but the low income families, the families like Mike had mentioned in his presentation, those people who may be working or receiving benefits, but they are, you know, below 30% of that area median income, and there is no way that they are able to afford a unit. And that is what this program is for, to be able to come in and assist them in getting them into secure and stable housing. And in order to do that, we need all of your help to provide that secure and stable housing. So that's what the program is specifically for, kind of that very low income. And Sarah can probably attest to this more. A lot of people might have zero income, or they have very minimal income, that there is no way that they are able to rent a unit out there in the market without assistance.
Perfect. Thank you, Lynn. Does anyone else have any other questions? Trying to check the chat here. Cassie, would you mind just talking briefly about the handouts that we'll provide after this class, and just kind of giving a brief overview of those while we wait to see if there's any other questions?
Sure. So there's going to be 3 different forms. One of them will be the actual RAFTA. That way you can look at, see all the information, because of course I know on the slides it comes up really small. There's going to be 2 others, and it's going to be the payment standards. One is going to be for the actual Colorado Springs Housing Authority. And again, it's going to differ then from DOH. You'll see they're effective January 1. And then again, they're going to go by zip code, and they're also going to go by bedroom size.
Perfect, thank you. And so to everyone that's on the call, we will send out the recording of this class following this, along with those attachments, so that you can go back and review it. I'm just going to do one last call out for questions, or if any of our panelists want to give any other final words of wisdom. We had a question. Hold on, one came in. I'm sorry, I got so excited. Okay, so the question is, just to confirm, previously we were allowed 5 apartments that used a voucher on January 1st. We now have to offer all apartments to anyone receiving a voucher.
I can maybe answer. You don't have to offer them. The new law is just saying you can't discriminate based on income source. I think that maybe that was answering your question. So you cannot, I think in the past, certain, maybe an apartment complex who said, we don't accept anybody with a voucher. That now with this law that goes into effect January 1st, that is under a protected class income source. And so you're no longer able to say that. You can still put other requirements in. Your screening process can still be the same. You just can't discriminate against someone who has a voucher. So they still have to meet all of your other screening criteria. And I think, as Mike had mentioned, there's great tenants out there, and then there are maybe more challenging and difficult tenants. And to me, in my experience, it doesn't necessarily, the challenging tenants, it's not just voucher holders. There's just challenging tenants out there and great tenants. And so I think just to say everyone who has a voucher, there are problems and they have issues, it's just on an individual basis. And so I always encourage any landlord, any apartment complex, screen your tenants, call old landlords, find out from their previous, landlord what their tenancy was like. So I think that that's how you can hopefully work to ensure that you're getting those quality tenants, the ones that are going to be staying there for 5 or 6 years. And as I think Mike and Cassandra both mentioned, it is a partnership. So I do feel like there's great people in Colorado Springs who work at the Independence Center in Rocky Mountain, Human Services and the VA that are there to work to make sure that it's a successful placement. And sometimes that doesn't happen and the person does need to, move on. But I think it really is a great partnership to be able to provide housing to some of these, just low income, disabled veterans. And we need people, and I appreciate everyone who's on the call, but people willing, to learn about these programs and to partnership with, with us to provide housing to these participants. That was my spiel, sorry.
That was great, Lynn, thank you. And
Thanks,
we did get, oh, I'm sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you to Lynn. Yeah.
Oh, So we do have a couple more questions here while that was coming in. So with the new Immigration Tenant Act protection, if an applicant does not have a social security number, can we use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9?
I'm not familiar with that. So can Lynn or Sarah or Cassandra, you guys got any information on that?
I'm not familiar with that either.
I mean, with our system, and I'm not familiar with that. If somebody, I'm not familiar with that law, we aren't allowed to use that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And maybe it might be different for different places. If people are, we work with HUD to try to get alternate IDs for participants who maybe don't have them. And the most time that is for infants who they don't have a social security card, or for non-residents. So, I mean, I'm happy to look into that, but the new Immigration Tenant Act protection forces, I don't know of that one. New
And that's
immigration.
okay if you don't, we can get that
sorry.
answer and get that to that person. So that's okay if you guys don't have an answer for that one. Let me keep going down. So the next question is, what if the prospective resident does not have an income and with the voucher they do not meet our requirements?
This is Sarah. I'm not sure what you mean by meet the requirements. The voucher, we do lease up quite a few people that are zero income. If the utilities are included, then that's even the best scenario for that individual. However, if they do have to pay a portion of utilities, they will get a utility allowance put on a card, which they will get the money off the card and pay their, if they have to put electric in their name, they'll pay their utilities. So on our end, just because they're zero income, they still do deserve to use their voucher and have a home.
This is Cassandra with Gretio. We have numerous residents who are on vouchers who, same thing, have zero income, and don't have any concerns with it. We get full payment from the state or the housing authority, and we just know that on their end, they're portion zero. And like I stated with the forms, that's where you really want to make sure if there's utilities, you're letting the PHA know so they can issue that utility allowance back to them.
Perfect, thank you. And then we did have a comment in here going back to that social security question, just for the person that asked that. Another person on the call said that their qualifying company told us to still run both credit and background with names and birthdays, no social or ITIN. So they should ask their qualifying company how to run with no social. So just to share that information with the person that asked. And then another question that came in is, will the applicants provide the needed forms, or will we have our own supply?
I can answer that. A lot of the individuals, when we do a briefing and we explain to them what the process is, we will give them copies of that request for tenancy approval, the RAFTA. We'll give them a couple copies because they might be applying at a couple different places. However, if they run out of the RAFTA or if they lose it, please feel free to reach out to the Independence Center and we can email it to you. And I always ask the managers that we're working with, just keep one on hand, make copies if they don't have one, or if it's done incorrectly, you'll have a backup copy. So if there's any forms that you do need, feel free to reach out to either the Housing Authority or the Independence Center. We have all those.
And the Colorado Springs Housing Authority, they have a really good website for landlord, and it has all the forms that are required as well. But again, even with the Housing Authority, usually the resident comes in, the prospective tenant comes in with all that information.
And really quick, I'll just say, at least for the state, let's say the W-9 form, that's a really big one, is that the state W-9 form has to be filled out. So it is our form. So if you just download one off of like Google it and fill out a W-9 form, a lot of times the state accounting department will reject that because they require it on the state form. So all those forms, like Sarah said, can reach out to her. Our website has some, and it sounds like Colorado Springs Housing Authority has an amazing website. The only thing that landlords, I think, need to provide is they have their own lease. So we want landlords using their own lease. We do not have leases for landlords to use.
Perfect, thank you. And then another question, so can you, I don't know if you all can talk briefly about if for some reason they don't qualify, are there places on your websites where you have assistance programs that can assist those tenants who don't qualify for maybe other housing options?
Meaning that when they initially applied, they didn't meet the income qualifications. I think we would refer them. There's a lot of different resources out there. I mean, I'm sorry to say a lot of times 211 is that resource, but sorry to say, but housing resources are in short supply. There is not enough ever to go around. And during this past year, that has been stretched even thinner. In the past, I want to say 5 or 6 years, state housing vouchers has become a thing. And so that never used to be the thing. The state of Colorado did not have their own pool of vouchers. We had federal money. And so that program is growing. And there's other tenant-based rental assistance, and there's rapid rehousing. So over the past, I don't know, 5, 6 years, there has been a lot more money coming into the Division of Housing to provide housing assistance, not just the Section 8 housing choice vouchers. So there's a lot more resources that are available for the residents of Colorado around the state, and we do serve the whole state of Colorado. And so our website is a good place to always check to, the Division of Housing's website, because we do have a lot of different kind of smaller rental assistance programs, some that work solely with taking people from, let's say, nursing homes and putting them out into the community. The Family Unification Voucher Program, which is for youth exiting foster care to homelessness, giving them resources. So the hard part is a lot of them are income-based, but there are some just temporary assistance and rapid rehousing for those folks that just need a little bit of help in order to get on their feet, and they don't need that long-term assistance.
Yeah, if I can jump in for a second, that's where our organization comes in, as we're Homes for All Veterans. We're a grantee of what's the Office of Veterans Affairs and what's called SSVF, or Supported Services for Veterans and Families. So what Lynn is saying, our program does offer time-limited rental assistance, which is called rapid rehousing, or another benefit we do is homeless prevention. So someone's who's at risk of being evicted or becoming homeless, we have time-limited money. That's different than what we're talking about here with the Housing Choice Voucher, which is a more long-term subsidy where the client or the person continues to qualify based on their income for up to X amount of years. Our program is typically based on a 3-month cert period, although we have clients that we've worked with for as much as 12 months at a time to provide, money for deposits or money for first month's rent, second month's rent, or if someone's getting behind on their rent, we can offer to get them caught up with those. But that's a veterans only program. The Office of Veterans Affairs, Volunteers of America is also another organization locally that has rapid rehousing dollars as well. So there are another organizations that's working with rapid rehousing or short-term rental assistance, like Linda's saying, rather than a longer term like subsidy, which is what housing choice vouchers are.
Perfect.
So there's
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of there housing supply, housing support is short, but there is quite a few out there. It's just a matter of knowing which ones are which, and what offer what. Basically, that's me.
Perfect. And then another question that came in is, will there need to be an addendum added to the lease that the provider of the voucher will need to sign?
With the HAP contract, and Sarah or whoever can jump in, there is what we call a tenancy addendum, and that's with the housing assistance payment contract that HUD, that the form HUD provides, and the owner and the PHA sign that. contract. And with that contract, a part of that is the tenancy addendum. And we require, and HUD requires, that that tenancy addendum is attached to the lease that the landlord and tenant sign. And so it just basically says, here's the tenant responsibilities under the program. But there's nothing else additional that they would need to be filling out.
And I can tell you with Gretio, all of the forms that we have anyone that's on a voucher sign, they don't do any different form or different addendum saying that they're on a voucher. Again, whatever we have with the addendum, it's attached to the HAP contract. So there's no additional documentation that we create on our end.
Perfect. And then another question is, can we charge Section 8 a holding fee to go on our wait list if we charge everyone else the same fee? Also, if a Section 8 resident pays their portion late, can we charge late fees?
I would say yes to both of those. I think that treating a section, anyone receiving assistance, they should, you're treating them like you would any other applicant. If you were just charging the people who came in with the voucher to be put on your waiting list, then, that's a violation, but you're charging everyone $25 to get on your waiting list. So anyone who comes in, you can charge them. And by all means, if someone on housing assistance isn't paying their portion, yes, you can charge them late fees. If for some reason the state's portion or the PHA, Colorado Springs Housing Authority portion, didn't make it to you, we recently, I don't know, maybe around the election time, a whole bunch of mail got back. Landlords were not getting their checks. We were getting hundreds of checks back for some odd reason. I think it was overwhelmed postal workers, but so they couldn't charge late fees on that. That was, we tried to send payment, it was out of our control, and we made sure we got those checks to those landlords. But for a tenant portion, by all means, you can charge them late fees.
Perfect. And then I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm just going to give last call if there's any other questions in the chat or the Q&A if you want to throw those in there.
I guess I just want to put one more thing in there about the HAP contract when that goes out with the rent letter. If you could complete that and sign your portion and send it back as quick as possible, because then we send that up to DOH. Independent Center sends it to DOH and Lynn, and then they sign off on it. So that is time sensitive to get that HAP back to the Independent Center.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you all so much for giving all of your incredible industry knowledge. We just really appreciate it, and thank you for everyone who was able to attend this class. Please look for an email following this with the recording and the handouts that we talked about today. I'll just leave it on for just one more minute in case someone's typing a very long question, but I'm just saying a lot of thank you. so we might be good to go. So thank you all so much, and I'll just, like I said, leave it open for one more minute, and if not, then I will end the meeting. So happy holidays, everyone.
To you too. Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.